Frost seeding switchgrass, frost seeding clover, frost seeding brassica. Would you ever frost seed brassica? I've gone through this throughout the decades. First started frost seeding clover back in '99, a long time ago. And so I have a little bit of experience frost seeding, and right now is a great time. Let's talk about first frosting. What is it? You're throwing the seed on the ground when there's frost and freeze taking place, lots of moisture. Right now, I don't even know what the date is. I've been so busy lately. Let's say it's March 25th, somewhere around there, and 26th, somewhere around there. Perfect time in a lot of the northern states, and even down into southern Indiana, southern Illinois, over into Missouri, all the way over into Pennsylvania, New York, the Northeast, to frost seed right now. That doesn't mean that you're even getting frost and freeze if you're getting excessive moisture. If you're getting a lot of moisture, if you're getting enough moisture that's going to germinate the seed, then you're doing a good job. So in order to frost seed, you have to have bare soil. So you're throwing seed on that bare soil. Excessive amounts of moisture, frost or freeze, or all of it, is actually sucking that seed into the soil. And as soon as the soil temperature hits the right temperature for the seed that you're frost seeding, then you get a great germination. That can work for clover, brassica, or switchgrass. And I'll talk about the clover and the brassica in a second. But switchgrass will germinate when the soil temperature is roughly right around corn and be in that 56 to 58 degree range. Switchgrass is the hardest one to germinate. It has to go through a process of stratification. Either it needs excessive moisture for many days in a row, or it's kept moist and damp, and then it'll germinate. So that's what the problem is in May. You might frost seed, let's say you threw switchgrass into the ground in May, even drilled it in the ground. If you have drought, if you have dry soil, that seed will still be viable, but it's not going to germinate till the following year. That's why a lot of late drilling switchgrass operations or plantings do not perform very well, because you'll get only a partial germination. Then you get more of a chance of weeds coming in, because switchgrass is a great smother crop once it establishes itself, but it cannot take any competition, so it'll get shaded out and dies. If you don't have a lot of seed, you don't get a good stand. If you're not getting good germination rates, even if that seed pops up the next year, it might pop up into a bunch of weeds, and if you don't have weed control, that's where most switchgrass plantings fail. And that's why frost seeding switchgrass is such a great advantage. I talk about clover. Clover, very easy to throw on the ground in thin stands of clover where they're soil exposed. You can throw it on the ground and you can get great germination rates. Used to do that back in '99, 2000, where I'd want to thicken a stand, so I'd put that clover. Throughout the years on that property up in the UP of Michigan, there was a time in the spring where I had 8 acres of plots with clover. Throughout the 10 years, I realized that a diminishing amount of clover was a great idea. If I was trying to attract a deer herd, then having that summer crop was great. But I found that a lot of those deer were not on the property because there's a wealth of habitat in the area. They were very spread out. So towards the end, I had 0 clover. Somewhere around in there for a few years, I managed 1 acre of clover. I still had to mow it out of 8 acres because that 1 acre still was an overabundant amount of clover compared to what the deer had in the area, so they didn't need to hit that clover. It wasn't even actually that important all the way up in the UP of Michigan in a wilderness setting, because they had a lot more food available. But again, throwing that seed on the soil, you have to have soil exposure. For frost seeding, I recommend at least 50% soil exposure, and that's even in another stand of clover, because that clover can actually fill in. And clover is shade tolerant, but not complete shade tolerant. And so if that clover is going to grow well around it, you're kind of wasting your time putting in that clover. So if you have an open bare field, you can throw clover in it, at least 50% soil exposure. And the thing about clover, it doesn't need to go through the stratification process exactly like switchgrass does. And so you just need moisture. So when you talk about frost seeding, it doesn't have to actually be during frost and freeze. In fact, if you're getting great rain and you have open soil and you've actually limited weed growth on a particular plot, you could look at clover and say, well, I have a week of moisture and it's early May. Well, you can quote frost seed that clover. Yes, you might not have frost in your area, but if you're getting a lot of rain, it'll germinate and you can do really well. I've planted a lot of clover just simply by throwing on top of the soil, even in the fall, mixed with brassica, mixed with rye, mixed with oats, and it does really well. You can actually get a successful stand just throwing on top of the soil. So it's not exactly frost seeding. Let's go down to Brassica here. Brassica, same thing. Throw it right on top of the soil. Rape, turnip, radish. Does really well by throwing it on top of the soil. If you get plenty of moisture, you'll get a great catch. It doesn't matter if it's in the spring, summer, or fall. If you have excessive moisture, you're gonna grow it. It's very easy. Get back to switchgrass here. Switchgrass is different. This is where frost seeding really matters, because it has to either go through that frost and freeze or excessive amounts of moisture to actually open up and be a viable seed to actually germinate that year when the soil temperature hits. If it's not opened up, if you don't get the moisture, the seed is very hardy. It'll stick in the ground and it'll germinate the following year. But if it's overcome by weeds at that time, if it's shaded out, then you're not going to get a good stand. So what I recommend with switchgrass, different than clover, different than brassica, and we'll talk about why you maybe not even bother with the clover, the brassica, but switchgrass is very good. You can actually frost seed it towards the end of September, middle of September, when your soil temperatures get below 56, 58 degrees. It's not going to germinate before the winter time. You can throw that out and get great germination rates by actually frost seeding on open soil the end of September and October. I have a client, Bill from Michigan. He does that all the time. He's got beautiful switchgrass, and Bill puts his in sometime in September, lets it sit all year, and you get great germination rates the following year. Again, it has to go through excessive moisture or frost and freeze, and certainly when you get in September in Michigan, you're going to get frost, freeze, and a lot of moisture before the soil temperature hits 56 to 58 degrees the following year. Switchgrass can also work well if you have a lot of moisture in April, even without the frost and freeze. Just getting it on the soil, getting a month of moisture, 2 weeks of good moisture, making sure that seed is in the ground and stays wet, stays damp for 10 days to 2 weeks, and you know you can count on it, then you're going to get a great catch, even if you don't get the frost and freeze. But it has to be moist, it has to be wet for a long time. And that works really well with switchgrass, that frost seeding process. If you've chemically controlled, you can actually frost seed anytime, and that's more of a true frost seeding. But you can actually frost seed anytime from late September in most areas all the way through March, end of March, and get a good catch. Now, with all of this, and the cool thing about switchgrass, I'll just add real quick, when you get near 100% germination like you do with switchgrass, then you have the ability to more compete with weeds that year. If you've limited weed growth to begin with simazine before spring green up, and then you've hit it with Roundup and 2,4-D right after, you can spray it right on the seed. It's not going to hurt it. Once germination takes place, like here in southwest Wisconsin, that would typically be end of May. Southern Michigan, that would be about the same time frame, right around there. If corn's popping and it's 4 to 5 inches high in your area, do not spray 2,4-D and glyphosate, that combination, on your switchgrass, because it's likely it's germinated, you're going to kill it. But if corn hasn't germinated in your area, you're pretty safe to actually spray up until that time. If I knew corn was germinating on a Thursday, I probably wouldn't spray on Wednesday. You know, don't want to cut it that close. But really look at your corn germinating in the area, and if it hasn't even come close to germinating yet and exposing itself in those first leaves, then it's safe to spray and get that last spraying. But you have to control the chemicals, and when you do that, then you get a great stand of switchgrass, and it's all because it was frost seeded. It went through enough moisture, frost freeze, to make that seed open up, go through the stratification process, and be viable. Clover and brassica, why bother? Brassica, you don't want to plant in the spring. Rape, turnips, radishes, it's not a spring planting. I did experiment with turnips back in the early 2000s. What I would do is, if I at least had 50% soil exposure within my clover, I would throw turnips on the ground, seed, sometime in mid-May. Those young plants can take a little bit of frost, but if you're going to have a month of frost and freeze afterwards, it's not going to be viable. What I found is in young clover that had 50% soil exposure, let's say it was planted with oats the previous year, the oats are dead, you're left with a decent stand of clover, I would add a little bit more clover to it. I'd add those turnips in there at a rate of 3 pounds per acre. And what I would end up with were turnips under that clover. Worked pretty well up in the UP of Michigan because it's such a short growing season. There's times up there where I lost buckwheat July 4th because we had snow and freezing temperatures. just a little bit of frost. I think it was 2002, somewhere around there, that we had so many frosty nights and cold weather throughout the entire summer that August was the only month that we didn't have frost or freeze. And September 1st, that morning, we actually had a frost. So that's how close it was to giving us frost freeze every single month. So when you have that short growing season, sometimes that's not a bad idea. You get those turnips to grow for June, July, August. They're established and protected by that clover underneath, so they're protected from the sun. You wouldn't want those exposed to the sun during the hot summer. That works in a very specific location. So for most of you out there, unless you're in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, maybe upstate New York, over into Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, a northern setting where you have a short growing season, then you're probably not going to use that practice. Experiment with that back, and what happens is if it gets too long of a growing season, that turnip gets mushy, it actually rots, and it just stinks up your clover plot. Whether the deer eat it or not, it's not the concern. It just is a waste of time. So in a short growing season, you can do that, and you want to make sure that you're not more than 2 weeks outside your last frost date in the spring. Clover. Why would you bother frost seeding clover? You can establish clover the fall before. There's information out there, and this is kind of what I went by back in the day, 99. It's kind of like, well, get this plot ready, spray it, and you bring soil into the wintertime, and then you have room to frost seed the next year in the spring. Why would you ever do that? You can actually get a crop going into the fall. Your whole idea is you want a food plot growing. You want something to offer the deer. So I started adding brassica and clover before anybody else in the country was, and that was back in 99, 2000, right around there. So putting the two together, because I knew the brassica would die out over the wintertime, so you add it to clover. Great fall crop. The brassica's gone, eaten down, and you're left with clover. Did the same with oats. Oats work really well because they die out during the fall, and you're left with clover in the spring. Maybe you'd frost seed to fill in holes of a light stand of clover. But why would you ever set up a field to actually just frost seed in the spring? Again, unless you have at least 50% of soil exposure, the other clover is actually going to shade out your germinating clover, and it's not going to allow it to grow. And if you have 50% of clover in the field and there's no weeds, it'll grow into a great crop. You don't need to waste your time in seeding. You don't need to just do it to just put some pictures on social media and say, hey, look, I'm frost seeding clover. That's cool. But if you already had 50% clover and no weeds, and the weeds aren't even a concern, but if you already had 50% clover in the field, why would you bother frost seeding? You can add clover and clover and oats together. You can add clover and rye, clover and brassica. If you have clover and rye, and this is all going back to my late 90s, early 2000 days of doing this, but I experimented a lot with all of this, and it kind of has led me to what I recommend today to my clients, my readers and viewers. But adding rye and clover together, you can get a great stand of clover. You either have to mow the rye out the following year consistently to chop it in half and kill it, or you just spray a grass-specific herbicide like clethodim on the actual clover and grass, and then you're left with just pure clover. It kills the rye out really fast. But you have to do something with the rye, or you're going to have very sparse clover, not a consistent food source, and you don't want to mow it when it's already developed a seed head and turning brown, because then you're just going to put a bunch of rye seeds on the ground to compete with the clover, and they will outcompete that of clover eventually, at least make a very sparse stand that's not really worth much. So frost seeding, I hope that makes sense why you'd frost seed, why you might not frost seed clover or brassica. If you're just making a field of, if you take an empty field of soil into the fall, that's a sin in my book. You don't want to do that. You can actually add something. Again, oats, rye, brassica, peas, late planted beans. They all go with clover that you can plant in the late summer, say in August for first planting. Then you have that cool season annual. And that's how I used to rotate my crops in the UP of Michigan. I was dividing them in half. I'd put that cool season annual with the clover, and then I'd have 1-year-old clover on the other side. And then the next year I'd take the almost 2-year-old clover, kill it, till it, redo it. And so I always had in the spring young clover, old clover, and that's how I managed those fields on a rotational basis. I wrote about that in the Quality Whitetails of the QDMA back in the early to mid 2000s. It's a great tactic, a great practice that I originated and practiced a lot, and it would work. But a lot of times you just didn't need that clover, so throughout the years I eliminated that. So try frost seeding, especially that switchgrass. I hope that makes sense. You can't frost seed in May for switchgrass. If you get a lot of rain, you could actually quote frost seed clover during May because you're going to have a lot of rain. But you want to get that clover established in the fall, because if you have 9 weeks of drought like I've run into before in the UP of Michigan and other locations during the summertime, then clover can die when it gets less than 1 inch of rain for 9 weeks. I found that out personally. And so if you get that clover established in the fall instead of frost seeding it, there's a lot of benefits to that. That's at a time when weeds are dying. That's at a time when moisture is increasing. By the time it gets into spring, it's ready to pop and grow fast. It's already has its root system established, and then it won't die during even the worst drought during the summertime. And that's a better way to get your clover established. Brassica, very limited use. Switchgrass, awesome for frost seeding. And I hope these tips help for frost seeding. It's frost seeding time right now in the whitetail habitat woods and fields, and I hope you have a great spring going forward and you have some great success with these frost seeding tips this season.